name is Mason Goad. I'm a junior researcher here at the National Association of Scholars, investigating the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. Today, however, we are discussing Educating for Citizenship, a series of case studies on civics education and how DEI has overshadowed it within universities of Arizona, Texas, and Utah. These reports were written over the past few months by one of our speakers today, Mr. John Seiler, a fellow here at the NAS, whose work has appeared in outlets such as City Journal, the National Review, and the New York Post. We are also joined by Matt Beinberg, the Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute, whose work focuses on promoting educational freedom, parental rights, and fostering greater appreciation for America's founding principles. Also joining us is Richard Lowry, an Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Texas, Austin, where he has worked since 2009. Professor Lowry completed his PhD in economics at Carnegie Mellon and is an affiliate head with the National Association of Scholars. Speakers will present for about 15 minutes, and then at the end, we will open the floor up to our audience for questions. You can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button below. A recording of this event will also be made available on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within a day or so. And with that said, it is a pleasure to have you all here today. Mr. Seiler, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Mason. At Weber State University, to fulfill the university and state's American institutions requirement, a requirement that's ultimately issued by the Utah System of Higher Education, students have the option to take History 1600, the Black experience, History 1610, the Latinx experience, and History 1620, the LGBTQ experience. In Arizona, the state's Board of Regents recently issued its own American Institutions requirement. The University of Arizona responded by creating a list or a test for students to take. Depending on student scores, the university will recommend optional classes, rendering the requirement nothing more than a gentle suggestion. And at the University of Texas at Austin, the Dell School of Medicine, undergraduates are expected to graduate with a set of health equity competencies. These include, among others, the following, quote, examine how the intersectionality of one's own multiple identities such as race, ethnicity, language, sex, sexual orientation, gender, age, ability, culture, socioeconomic status, geographic location, and immigration status influence one's thoughts and actions, end quote. Today, the National Association of Scholars released its final case study in the Educating for Citizenship series, a collection of studies that examines how civics is taught in higher education in 3 states, as Mason mentioned, Arizona, Texas, and Utah. Civics is always a relevant issue in education. After all, public education exists in large part to train students for citizenship. But it seems especially important now as our news cycle addiction yields ever more bad takes, particularly about politics. One need only read recent remarks about the Supreme Court to know what I'm talking about. What we found in all 3 of the studies that I authored in the Educating for Citizenship series is this, that the civics curriculum, regardless of how robust or how minimal it is increasingly being overshadowed in higher education by diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, which constitutes its own alternative form of civics education, which includes a vision for civic life, a story about American history, and specific positive statements about the role of government, all of which stand in deep contrast to what would traditionally be called civics education. So each of my studies is broken into 2 parts, and that's what I'm going to be explaining in this presentation. The first part is on how civics is taught in the formal curriculum, so the requirements that exist for students that will enable them to learn about our political system, political life, or American history. And then the second part is on how DEI initiatives increasingly kind of stand in to fill that role. And what we found is that in some states, the formal requirements for civics education are so minimal, and they're in some cases so poorly followed, that really off the bat, the only place where students are assured to get a comprehensive education in American history, an education that at least purports to tell students about what civic life should be all about, what American government is all about, is not in the classroom at all, although some students might happen to take an American history class or American government class that can orient them in the right direction. Typically, in certain states, that role has been almost entirely given over to diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. So let me talk first about how civics is taught formally in higher education. So civics education in higher ed usually comes in the form of American government and history requirements. This is where students will learn about the ideas that formed our system of government, the function of government, our major public policy disputes, the roles and responsibilities of citizenship. And across the 3 states we surveyed, we can pretty easily divide these states into different categories: the good, the bad, and the, well, mediocre, I'll say. So the good, I would deem the state of Texas as by far the best model for civics and history requirements for students. So each student in Texas higher education, public higher education, is required to take 2 courses in American history and 2 courses in American government, which means that even with some rule bending by different universities, the requirement is so robust that students are almost guaranteed to receive some training in what the American Constitution looks like, what major events in American history. And this requirement even is not followed perfectly. So one example I bring up in the study is that at UT Austin, a student can satisfy the American history requirement by taking such combinations of classes as history 340, the Chinese in the United States, and history 356, America and the Holocaust. Of course, this is perfectly valid and valuable content, but that falls pretty far from the clear intent of such a requirement, which is, to require students to engage in basically a comprehensive survey of American history. So, nevertheless, we've sort of decided to deem Texas the best example of how to require American history in government in higher education, and we encourage other states to adopt what we call the Texas model. Moving on to the bad, we would say that at the moment, of the 3 states that we surveyed, the state of Arizona is doing the worst at requiring any formal civics education. Recently, the Arizona Board of Education passed an American institutions requirement requiring 1 course on the topic. But so far, Arizona's major state universities have, well, signaled only lackluster compliance with this new rule. So like I said, at the University of Arizona, students simply get an exam, and if they pass that, and if they fail to demonstrate proper knowledge in the subject, they'll be given, well, some recommended courses. Currently at ASU, the requirement's simply not incorporated yet, so we're eagerly awaiting some sort of signal from ASU that they're actually taking the requirement seriously. And at Northern Arizona University, something interesting has happened. Northern Arizona University did agree to basically incorporate an American institutions course into its core curriculum, but they also pushed hard to expand their what's called the diversity. I believe it's just called the diversity curriculum requirement from 2 courses to 4 courses. Now, there's some debate over whether they've actually managed to push that requirement up to 4 courses. I've recently learned that there's a little bit of dispute over whether it's 3 or 4 courses. But what's interesting, regardless, is that the Diversity Curriculum Committee at Northern Arizona University has been very clear that only courses that incorporate critical theory can qualify for this requirement. So Northern Arizona University, while they're incorporating an American institutions course, which is great, they're also counterbalancing that course with 3 or maybe even 4 courses that must incorporate critical theory in order to qualify in the first place. Finally, in Utah does require 1 course students to take 1 course in civics in American institutions. For the most part, most public universities in Utah do follow this requirement. But as I've mentioned before, loopholes still exist. And those loopholes are especially easy for students to take advantage of when your American civics education requirements are so minimal that really there's only 1 course. That makes it very easy for students to bypass the intent of the rule. But what I think is a more interesting finding that all of our reports point to is not actually found in the civics or the formal curriculum at all. What we have found is that in every state, Texas, Arizona, and Utah, there has been a precipitous increase in diversity, equity, and inclusion programming that has effectively mandated that a certain particular view of American history and American, the obligations of American citizens become something of an institutional policy. And this constitutes a major part of all 3 of the studies that we publish. So I would encourage you to go look at each of those studies. But I want to highlight a few examples just to show exactly how that is rapidly becoming the de facto civics education in all 3 states. So in Utah, the Utah system of higher education, which is the governing body that controls Utah's 4-year institutions, released what they called an equity lens framework, which they encouraged each of their universities to adopt and use as a guide for all institutional policy. This equity lens framework, according to the Utah system of higher education, was grounded in critical race theory. And you can, even if they did not overtly admit that, which they do in the document, you can also see it just on the basis of who they quote in the document. They quote people who are basically the founding voices of critical race theory. And that is now a feature coming from the top, encouraging basically all policy in Utah. What's the result? Well, the result is you get basically a flurry of requirements, events, policies, initiatives in that state that don't just offer a free market of ideas to be explored, but rather push for a specific vision of American history, American civic life, and really a comprehensive account of how our country exists and how it ought to exist. So for instance, Utah State University in 2019 hosted its annual Inclusive Excellence Symposium. The keynote address focused on how systemic racism exposes all to racial ignorance, and more notably on strategies for transforming our knowledge into concrete social change. So that's just one example coming from Utah. In university after university, time after time, these events are basically encouraged from the administration on down to the departments. And not only that, but perhaps the most interesting and I would say disturbing finding of the report held true in Utah. And that is, it is a consistent trend within universities to make a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion a requirement not only for job applicants at these universities, but a requirement for promotion and tenure evaluations, which means that faculty members who might want to provide a different perspective on American life, those faculty members either have to be effectively silenced or they risk losing their job. And this, I think, has profound effects on the way that students will leave their universities and the way that they will think about American civic life. And so that's a brief overview of the report, and I'm really excited to talk about it today.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Seiler. Matt, over to you. What have you got for us today?
Well, thank you very much for having me. And John, the work that you and the NAS team have done, I think, is hugely important. And it's not only for what you guys have spotlighted and kind of shined a light on, but I think what that tells us about what's in the dark all throughout the rest of the country. I mean, the case studies that you're looking at, these are 3 red states, right? And I know you said Texas doing a little bit better than Arizona and Utah in that evaluation, but these are red states. And even as Arizona, for instance, during the Trump years, has been more purple on kind of national elections. This is a state with a governor and a state legislature, which have been fiercely in favor of constitutional education, civic education. And so to see this kind of stuff happening, even in states like this, I think is kind of an alarm and a warning sign for us across the nation. We sort of expect a lot of this in places like California. This is not, just confined to New York, California, San Francisco type of environments. This is a national issue. And I think your report points to an issue, and I'll jump into obviously the focus here of higher education, but I think part of recognizing this is that what we're seeing is institutional failure throughout every level of our education system. Obviously, the problems of higher education are compounding it, but ultimately college, university, that's the last phase of students, formal education. And part of the issue is what kids are coming into the colleges with, right? So we're seeing at the K-12 level, instead of students at least entering with that baseline, knowledge of civics and American history, coming in having been taught things like the 1619 Project, being used in thousands of classrooms across all 50 states, their school districts taking up, BLM resolutions, denouncing the police and systemic racism and oppression. You don't see any resolutions, in support of the Constitution in the same way. And, pre-pandemic, the Department of Education, this is even before test scores, I think, as we're seeing, tanking across the board. Even worse, back in 2018, the US Department of Education reported 15% of American 8th graders, proficient in history, less than a quarter proficient in civics, right? So the majority of kids going to public schools right now, those kids in our K-12 system are essentially being failed and not being introduced to these concepts, right? Again, if they're learning something like the 1619 Project, and then you see the folks behind that, Nicole Hannah-Jones and others, then getting offered tenured positions at universities, for pushing essentially ideological propaganda that masquerades as journalism or history, those same individuals, having a foot basically in both the K-12 and the higher education space in terms of what kids are learning. And I think that we see this, again, it's sort of self-perpetuating cycle of the universities helping to train the teachers, preparing the students to come through, the kids coming through, and it's the self-reinforcing cycle. And so I think that your report here helps kind of shine a light on one of these pieces and does introduce this notion of it really is time to break this link. And, kind of before jumping into and responding a little bit to some of the findings that again, you spotlighted, which are fantastic. Again, this is a national issue. We've seen even over the last year or so other reports that have come out and corroborated. This is, the left likes to say, if you point to examples, they'll say, well, that's just an anecdote. That's not really representative. Or if you show data, they say, well, really what you need to focus on is the lived experience of this person. Don't show me data. They kind of pivot back and forth. And so I think showing, individual case studies like this alongside kind of national data, folks like Jay Green at Heritage, last year put out his report on DEI bloat. The findings from that report, I think are fairly alarming. It's that universities have 4 times as many DEI staff as they do staff assigned to help students with disabilities. It's 1.5 times as many staff doing DEI as history faculty, right? So more positions at universities devoted to DEI than actually, even teaching history. And that's not even saying a particular wing of history, right? This is just broadly being able to inform students of civilization and its history versus kind of the latest trend in DEI. And so I think that, that sort of thing here is pretty shocking. As they found, it was 45 people on average at the university and college level at these institutions having official duties to promote DEI. And that's not even counting, Title IX, the sort of official, sex discrimination compliance issues. This is all sort of optional. We have bloated the university with DEI staffers and an army of them to do that. And obviously, speaking kind of from the perspective here, based in Arizona, you look at the universities here and ASU, which is substantially larger than U of A. U of A has twice as many DEI staffers, based on that data, right? So this is something that, as you kind of see, the balance shifting in a lot of these institutions, really going full-throated, but support of these initiatives, I think corroborates again what you're kind of showing in these case studies here. And we've done a lot of work, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute. The issue of these DEI statements and essentially ensuring ideological conformity and screening out any ideas that might question that orthodox, right? And so, the folks at AEI, also last year put out a report looking at how universities and colleges are dealing with these statements. It's not just, again, isolated examples in Arizona or Utah. Out of, it's about 1,000 listings that they looked at, 20% of those required diversity statements. And that was a pretty conservative estimate. They weren't even counting ones that just said equity and, that sort of stuff. So, and, we've seen examples. This, again, is not even just higher education. It's even in K-12, right? Education Week's written on this, that this is now becoming sort of standard practice, as a lot of these practices bleed down from the university level into K-12, which I think is sort of doubly ironic. We hear all about a teacher shortage, especially at K-12, and then schools are turning around and basically screening out applicants to say, do you align with us? And if not, maybe this isn't the right profession for you. I think is honestly alarming and fairly offensive to the notion that we're trying to get the best educators and we're going to screen them out. So again, I think that kind of lays the backdrop for what we're seeing. And your studies here, as you pointed out in Arizona, for instance, our Board of Regents, which governs the universities, even if, as they've put in some of these broad parameters to say, we expect there to be instruction on American institutions, seeing the actual follow through from the universities. And as you said, right, U of A, for example, as you pointed out, if they're just having the kids come in and take a civics test and then not really do anything with it, well, as the numbers that I mentioned from the Department of Education, if those kids are coming in and 1 in 5 have any basic understanding of civics, and they're going to come through and essentially not get any, anything to remediate that, much less build upon it, you again are sort of perpetuating this, and it's a sort of endless cycle. And the NAU example that you also kind of touched on, and one of the things I think that's fascinating in the report you point out, not only are they saying you have to check off these certain elements that meet our diversity requirements, but as mentioned, something like foreign languages get axed with the diversity committee, saying that actually doesn't count because it doesn't include this critical theory element to it, which is a pretty bold declaration to say we are essentially forcing students who want to get a state certification of having a degree. If you want to get that blessing from the state that you are educated at the college level, you are forced to go through this. It's not even an issue of does this exist? Is this an offering there? It's you are literally being tracked into it. And if you don't, you're essentially locked out from that public certification of having a degree from public universities, taxpayer-supported universities and institutions. So I think that's obviously doesn't set the most promising stage, and I think a lot of us do tend to focus on the negatives a lot. So the question is like, well, what can be done, right? What do we do in response to all of this? And we can talk a little bit more during the Q&A, but there's broadly there's 2 areas. One is stopping the bad, the other is promoting the good. And so part of it is kind of cutting off the pipeline of this requirement, again, that whether it be students or teachers that get forcibly tracked into this, sort of suppressing ideological diversity to the exclusion of just essentially superficial demographic diversity that doesn't actually bring necessarily differences of opinion. And the other is actually promoting civics. So You touched on Arizona, for instance, and one of, I think, the bright spots, and I think we are seeing this now become a model for the nation. The legislature back in 2017 looked at it and said, hey, our students need to be learning American civics and American history. And they actually created a new standalone department at ASU, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, which basically is a walled off section of funding that the legislature says, this money, we are now appropriating a specific pot that goes only to this department. And this department, again, focused on American constitutionalism, classical American Western tradition, great books type of learning. This department now has something like 400 plus students in its introductory level classes, having gone from just a handful a few years ago, and now putting out, so it's an undergraduate major for kids to be focusing on actual American civics and debates in American politics, learning federalism. They've just put out a civic literacy curriculum for high school kids to be able to actually, again, not only learn the basics of what's on the civics exam, the nationalization exam, but to actually understand what's the rationale for federalism, what was the reason, for framing the Constitution this way, and also comparing that to say, what is some of the backgrounds of other forms of government in the rest of the world. Communism under the Soviet Union, right? Some of these using primary sources to educate kids, because I do think one of the talking points from the left, right, is to say, well, the folks on the right who promote American exceptionalism or the United States whitewash history, and we try to only show the good, which obviously I would dispute. I think most of us say we should absolutely present history as it is. But I think one of the things that the left likes to do is pretend that the United States exists in a vacuum, or that American history or the blotches on our history exist in a vacuum, and have students never be exposed to what are other forms of government, other historical patterns that we've seen of oppression and real structural oppression, in some of these left-leaning totalitarian regimes that they would promote. So again, the Skettle program at ASU, I think, is a model for the rest of the nation that legislators should look to and say, if we are funding our universities, maybe it's time to reconsider just cutting a blank check and start to create sort of an island of some degree of actual substantive civic instruction for students. So that's one that I think is hugely, and again, we're seeing others kind of pop up now around the country. We at Goldwater, put forward campus free speech model legislation to say universities that are going to take a stance and say, we are not going to crack down and have viewpoint discrimination on students. This has gotten passed now in several states. Again, making sure that the universities as areas of intellectual inquiry are not being walled off and suppressing voices that may not toe the line. And then lastly, in terms of kind of, again, pushing back on DEI, we've put out model policy dealing with DEI, CRT, kind of whatever label it comes underneath, to say we're going to crack down on both the application of this and the instruction of this. Obviously, higher education, academic freedom means, again, professors have the freedom to teach this, but it is another thing to say that professors must teach this, or that students must take classes in this, or that faculty will only be hired if they support this. So we've put out model policy. It passed through the Arizona House this session. We'll be working on getting that the rest of the way. That basically bans the use of DEI statements as political tests. Arizona's constitution already bans political tests. And this basically goes through there and lays out how these diversity statements function as that, and prevents the universities in K-12 from soliciting applicants to basically provide these statements or get judged according to how much the candidates, sort of message around DEI. And also blocks the application of these DEI, CRT types of proposals that says you are not allowed to discriminate in any hiring, promotion, admissions, disciplinary decisions on the basis of race. A lot of states like Arizona, we have affirmative action bans, but there's a carve out in there that basically says if you're a federal contractor, there's some kind of wiggle room here. And the legislation would essentially go in and say, under no circumstance can you discriminate against an applicant within a pool of applicants based upon race or this kind of DEI type of requirements. So I do think it's essential that the universities do require general education requirements in civics and American history. And I do think that it's fair for legislators to look at it and say, if there want to be classes that are offered in DEI or CRT, that's one thing. But it's awfully difficult to argue that there is a rationale that a university should be able to be the gatekeeper and force students to take classes in that. If the legislature is providing funding for that institution, the legislature very much is in the right to say, you do not get a blank check and a free ticket to mandate that kids who get our state certification of having a degree have gone through CRT or DEI training.
Thank you very much, Matt. Professor Lowry, over to you.
Thanks. So thanks for the opportunity. I guess I'm coming from Texas, and I'm maybe kind of the downer on Texas because as the report highlights, the actual laws, the rules that apply in Texas are amongst the strongest of the ones that have been studied. But in my experience with the university is a lot more on the side of how do they get around this? How do they make sure they do the worst possible job of educating students in the way that a reasonable person would want them educated about civics? And so what I'm going to try to do is go through the experience that we had sort of looking at what's going on broadly at the university with respect to this stuff, what we thought needed to be done, and how both of these things are problematic, and how we sort of completely failed to fix anything in Texas, even with all the rules written kind of in a way that should be favorable. So we sort of started out, a small group of us in the business school started out with the observation that it was really hard to get through a degree at the University of Texas with anything like a decent foundation in the basics of how our society, or a free society in general, functions. And we started observing with our business students the sort of attitudes they have towards things like capitalism, free markets. It was a combination of hostility based on what they'd been taught in other classes, and just kind of eye rolling about what they'd heard in other classes, but nobody had these foundations anymore. And we thought maybe we should do something about that. And so that process started off. There's a small policy center that we were working in, and we started offering what are called signature classes. So every freshman is supposed to be like a liberal arts college style seminar. And we thought, oh, well, let's offer a seminar for the freshmen in kind of these foundational ideas, like what's true about society, what are the facts of capitalism, what are the theories underlying this. And part of that process, we got to see the syllabuses of the other signature classes. And this is where you start to see this undermining of the intent. And all of these classes had this, the vast majority had this flavor of oppression and the studying of oppression, and how, everything was about oppression, and it goes on and on. And we'd been in business school a little bit isolated from that. So that was really striking. We're like, oh, we really need to do this. So we kind of doubled down. We built that class, and it never seemed like enough. And then we started to become kind of the focal point where people would come to us and talk about these things. And so we learned some more, we learned about these civics requirements, the American history and the American government. And in talking to some of the faculty who teach those classes, is, well, there's one or two people, and they're unfortunately not on the younger side, who teach the sort of class that the legislature had in mind. And then there's a whole bunch of younger people who teach the sort of classes that John was describing. And our impression, most of this space is getting taken up by these, race, class, gender topics classes in place of this. And then there's these Texas history requirements, and that's one of these test things. And then when I spoke to some of my students, apparently the answer is C. So if you want to place out of having to take anything about Texas government or Texas history, as long as you answer C to all of the questions, you'll be fine. Now, is this an urban legend within the school? I just know nobody fails that test. Nobody gets told to take that. I don't know how they're able to get away with this, but there's an awful lot of effort to make sure those rules are not followed. And then digging even deeper, we have this other trick, and I'm kind of hammering on this, but the importance of our experience is, even if you write the rules well, faculty and administrators will get around the rules. And so the other sort of fascinating case study in this is we have these flag requirements. And this is something that the University of Texas invented to make sure you couldn't use enough of your community college transfers to get credit at UT for enough classes to graduate. So they wanted to make sure you had to take more classes at UT. And so they set up separate requirements other than the required civics classes, other than the actual core requirements. There are special flags that you can apply for in a class, and a student has to collect five of these flags. And what these flags are is you apply to a faculty committee to get a flag that you cover a topic. 2 of these flags are explicit DEI flags. So you have to have one class on cultural diversity in the United States. One of the way your classes qualifies as a cultural diversity in the United States flag is to have an activism project. So if you assign your students to go out and do some sort of left-wing activism, you get qualified for this flag. So who is it who's going to get, which of the civics classes are going to also carry the flag, making them more appealing to the students because you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. It's going to be, and it's systematically all the postmodern radical activist classes get these flags. The committees that determine the flags are faculty who, and I don't know how much, the people who choose to get on these committees have a particular bet. So there's one flag called the ethics flag. So everyone has to get their ethics flag. And to get that, you have to go through the faculty committee. Well, if you have Adam Smith in there, you're going to get yelled at for being unbalanced. You need more postmodernism, and you have to fight to get that ethics flag, which then makes your class appealing because it fulfills this requirement. I had this experience, and someone came to this. I got myself on the flag committee for the ethics flag, and I was promptly expelled from the flag committee against all the rules at the university because I said, well, if we're going to require the conservative leaning classes to have even more postmodernism than they already had, shouldn't the intersectional feminist class, which was going to get the ethics flag, also have that? So this is how they make sure, not only do they make it available that you can get around all of our requirements with this postmodern race, sex, classes, they make it particularly appealing. So they have worked very hard to get around the legislative requirements. And there's nobody watching the store. Nobody is checking to see that the university isn't cheating on these requirements. Apparently, nobody even knew that they had put in this flag system to get around the requirement that they take transfer credits for survey classes. Because frankly, if you want a good survey class on American history in Texas, you really almost have to go to a community college because it's so low status for UT Austin. So this is the sort of thing that's going on. The evasions are intense. Furthermore, they're taking their grants coming out of the president's office. So that's direct taxpayer money is being used by the education school to develop material to promote the DEI civics for 4 and 5-year-olds. So we have a program. It got, I think it was $100,000 for the UT Austin Education School to promote Abraham Kendi and Robin DiAngelo to preschoolers. So that's where, for all the nice writings in the bills, we're taking taxpayer money and putting DEI rather than civics in front of 4-year-olds. So what did we do about this? Well, we came up with this plan to create something similar to what they have in Arizona. And it was going to be called the Liberty Institute. And we were going to create an independent faculty, just like Arizona has, with the ability to hire tenure track faculty that would offer basically a major in, we were calling it politics, philosophy, economics, and evidence. So civics plus statistics plus econometrics. So you could actually go through UT and get a serious understanding of how free societies work, modeled somewhat on what's being done in Arizona and discussions with other places. We came up with this plan after we got encouragement from supporters and donors and alumni because they were concerned about how things were going. We did have one donor meeting where we had where one of us read out the recommended land acknowledgement about how UT is on lands that were taken from blah, 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 and that we're actually on Turtle Island, not North America. And that got people worked up. And so we pushed through. We even got the government to fund this, as they did in Arizona, but perhaps not to anyone's great surprise. The administration played along with this. And then when it came time to actually implement it, the person put in charge of the implementation was a member of the Mexican American Latina Studies Department, who teaches Marxist dance and is a critical race theorist and is currently the vice president of academic priorities at the University of Texas. So he was tasked with figuring out what this structure should be and figuring out how it should be run, and all of the promises that were made to the Texas government that we would have something Arizona like an independent faculty, that was thrown away, and we were told you could give the money to existing departments to hire people they want to hire. So this was the solution for the University of Texas for bringing new ideas to campus, is to provide more funding to critical race theorists who are running all of our departments currently. So we tried and we failed completely, despite the fact that the legislature writes rules like you need to do all of this. So even in a state with a sympathetic legislature, we failed to bring good civics and just fact-based information to the university. So, what does that? Let's see. I'm sorry, I kind of lost track of time, but I want to. I think I have a couple minutes, right? So I think a lot of this ties back into the DEI situation. So why did we fail? We failed because the university has consistently empowered the most extreme elements on the faculty, the most committed to critical race theory possible. Out of the 5 people now who vote on all university-wide tenure cases, so do you get to stay at this university and keep teaching? The current president has promoted 2 people onto that committee who are both avowed critical race theorists. So the DEI infrastructure in the administration and amongst the faculty now has more power than any other group on campus. They're able to get all this funding for all of their initiatives. The university encourages decolonization of the curriculum throughout the university. So that's our thing. So why do we have all of this? Why do we have an official policy that DEI and CRT must infuse every element of the university? Why does every job at UT have to take into account your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, the answer, as far as I can tell, is politicians and donors and alumni, even though they are conservative, will not do anything about this. So that is just what we've seen. There's no willingness to confront these people. They're given more and more power. People get appointed to govern the university, and they're very aggressively supporting this stuff, even though they're being appointed by people who have to survive Republican primaries. So why this is the case, I don't know, but I can tell you DEI is not at the University of Texas because of loony Marxists, in the terms used by our lieutenant governor. It's at the University of Texas because of the government of the state of Texas and their unwillingness to confront it. So I guess that about does my 12 minutes. So thank y'all.
Oh, thank you very much. So we have a question from Mr. Michael Myers for the New York Civil Rights Coalition. Isn't it the faculty's role to inform and guide the curriculum to give students both a broad and specific look at history, civics, and American culture, which has to include diversity and race issues in the student studies?
Yeah, so the faculty certainly need to play a hand in constructing the curriculum. They obviously have academic freedom, which means that faculty should be able to say what they want to say in the classroom. That doesn't mean that we should just have universities totally unguided by any concerns that come from outside the faculty. So if faculty members say at a particular university, just to give a crazy example, wanted to devote seven core courses to animal anatomy, we would say that there is no point to funding a university system like that. That's not really fundamental. That's not an important issue. And there's really no reason that the state has an interest in funding that kind of education. So we do have to answer the question, what's the point of state education, state-funded education to begin with? And there's obviously a sort of utilitarian role that it plays. We're training people to be able to go out and work and be good, employees and kind of be able to be leaders in civil society, but that's not exclusively it. And the whole premise of having requirements like American history at all point to a sort of civic mission of the university, that we should not just be training students to be good employees. In fact, I don't even think that's the primary, really a compelling primary purpose of higher education. It's to train people for citizenship. So the question of how to train people for citizenship then becomes really important. And the basic argument that I think everyone on this panel would make is that when you excessively emphasize the concepts of intersectionality, the omnipresence of oppression, the idea that everything should be filtered through the lens of race, class, and gender, you actually create an extremely distorted image of what civic life should look like in America. And now that's up for debate, but what we've basically been arguing is that that's a really bad vision for American civic life. And moreover, that's basically increasingly the only vision for American civic life that students receive. So students are going to receive very, very, students in Arizona and Utah are going to receive very, very few, very little education in, say, the American Constitution, primary texts that reveal the ideas behind the legal system we have, the institutions that we have today. And you're not even equipped to criticize those institutions very well if you don't know the ideas that brought them here. So you can say that the ideas of the founding fathers are something that you disagree with. Sure, that's a great debate to have. That's a debate that's live, for better or worse, that's a live debate that's existing in our country today. But we don't even get to that point. And why don't we get to that point? One of the reasons we don't get to that point is precisely because we have kind of an excessive emphasis on teaching students the conclusion that those views aren't even worth considering in the first place. And we have faculty members who are filtered out based on their adherence to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which essentially entails a political commitment to begin with. If you're requiring faculty members to demonstrate their views on, say, their understanding of intersectionality, well, some faculty members, I think rightly, reject the concept of intersectionality as a helpful framework for understanding the world in the first place. And they do so on the grounds that intersectionality is basically, a concept rooted in critical race theory that requires people to view the world through the lens of oppression. And there are different ways to see the world. Nevertheless, faculty members in all three of the states that we pointed to are increasingly being required to continue to demonstrate their commitment to these kinds of ideas. And in an environment like that, I just don't think that we have a situation where it's just faculty members, trying to fulfill a civic mission that's generally agreed upon. It's faculty members, and I would say actually a very small number of administrators, as I think Richard aptly pointed out, a small number of administrators who are shoving this down the throats of people who are in some ways just unaware of what's going on at universities in the first place. But yeah, this is a live debate over education, and what we're saying is that a civics education needs to involve some specific things it needs to involve the study of kind of a survey study of American history that's not overtly focused on getting specific outcomes or specific ideas ingrained in students' minds, ideas like the concept of intersectionality. It should involve the teaching of, primary texts that are important to America's history. And there are a set of primary texts that I think everyone would agree are important to America's history insofar as you think that it's important to study America's history at all. And, if faculty members are opposing that, if faculty members are saying that that shouldn't be taught, then I think it's appropriate for other people to step in and say, no, this is actually not, this is failing a fundamental purpose of public higher education, and it needs reform.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that to follow up? I'll probably just mostly repeat some things John said, but I think it's important. And there's sort of two elements within the question and the answer, and I think it's related to academic freedom and faculty governance. And the first thing that has to be understood is that once a university has imposed a DEI policy, and not some hypothetical one, but any of the policies that I've ever seen and anything on those principles, that university no longer has academic freedom. So it's moot. So one of the more ridiculous things we have is, around here, the lieutenant governor got a little upset with the faculty and, started promoting some ideas of reform, and everyone got, even institution, groups, not the National Association of Scholars, but other groups that ought to be standing up against these sorts of DEI things, that, they'll take any opportunity to go after someone like our lieutenant governor. And they, the claim is he's interfering with academic freedom. But no, you cannot interfere with academic freedom at a public university in Texas, because we have a policy that says you have to believe these things. If you want to get promoted or hired at the University of Texas, they have to take into account your inclusion, which means, are you willing to sacrifice the truth in order to make marginalized groups feel welcome and comfortable on campus? We do not have academic freedom. It is moot. Nothing the university can, nothing the state government can do will interfere with academic freedom at the University of Texas, because it's gone. The other question is about, relating to the faculty's role in setting the curriculum. This is, again, people go back, we need faculty governance. No, we tried faculty governance. We gave the faculty autonomy, and what they did with that autonomy was convert the university away from a place that looks for truth and tries to teach people how to think carefully and about actual facts, to a place that is focused entirely on activism. We have an official program that teaches faculty that in their public intellectual role, don't let facts get in the way of effectiveness. We are taught to lie in order to promote a particular agenda. That is what infuses any curriculum that's set by the faculty. And we just have to accept that faculty governance was a failed experiment. And it's not great to have Dan Patrick setting the curriculum, but it's probably better than the people who are currently doing it at UT. Because if you're the sort of person who says, don't let facts get in the way of effectiveness, you're not the sort of person we need setting the curriculum.
Thank you, Dr. Lowry. We have a question I'm going to pass right back to you from a viewer named Dan, who starts with quite an interesting quote. You can run a country with bad laws if you have good people. With bad people, you can't run a country even with good laws. And his question is simply, can this cancer still be cured without killing the patient, so to speak? Would we be able to actually set up parallel institutions and change rules? And I want to ask you that because you've actually tried to do that on the inside with what seems to be little success, getting on a committee and immediately expelled. So what are your thoughts?
Also, I mean, I think even, that's a very good question. It was something I'd hoped to address, but I didn't. The way a state university is set up, at least all the ones I've looked at, it's very hierarchical. If you had a president who really wanted to change an institution, he could do it very easily. The problem in a place like Texas is you always get terrible people in university governments. So no set of rules, and this is exactly the Bismarck quote, no set of rules will change a thing about the University of Texas until you start putting decent people in charge, and there is an absolute refusal to put decent people in charge. We have, in my time at the University of Texas, there's been one good regent appointed, and he actually looked into what was going on at UT and found some problems, and for his troubles, he was impeached and indicted. The Travis County District Attorney indicted Wallace Hall for doing open records requests to find out that admissions at the University of Texas were corrupt. They push Wallace Hall out and they bring in Kevin L. Tife, who is who's facilitated all of the DEI stuff, who was instrumental in killing our attempts to build institutions. So yeah, you can write whatever law you want. If you keep putting terrible people in charge, it won't go well. But there's just this intense desire to put these terrible people in charge. The only person who should be in charge of universities in Texas, in my opinion, is Wallace Hall. But that's that's a tough sell, probably even to Wallace Hall. So yeah, I mean, it's a problem until there's good leadership. You don't need the faculty to get that much better. As long as the leadership is good, he can marginalize the terrible faculty, and he can allow us to offer what we wanted. But you just put in these terrible people and they destroy us, they expel people from committees. And yeah, no, it's really about personnel more than laws.
If I can jump in on that one too. I mean, I think the case studies of Arizona and Texas, right, show this succeeding and then getting derailed in one instance versus the other. Again, with Arizona, and I think you have both models that offer opportunities, whether it is starting a new completely separate institution from the ground up, or building something within those existing institutions that has that autonomy, right? So obviously you have the advantage of it being something completely detached and separate if you start from scratch. If you, as Arizona did with the legislature, going and say, look, we pour in hundreds of millions of dollars every year to our public university system, we're not simply going to abandon that. We're going to actually put something in there, right? The number of kids that matriculate through that system, if you are basically just writing them off, you are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a system that then is leaving those kids bereft of any of that knowledge. So establishing something like the Scuttle program at ASU that says, we've got kids that may be going and majoring in business or other areas. Now they're actually going to be able to dip their toe into this and take classes in it, decide that they want to get a minor or a major and actually get that exposure to it, I think has been hugely successful. And I think it's dispiriting to see kind of what's happened in Texas. But I think the Arizona model does show, even as so much of the rest of higher education is failing, the legislature, if they are serious about it, and they actually do create a system here that's going to have, again, with hundreds of kids going through it now, helping to train basically the next, sets of teachers, doing summer camps for kids, putting out resources. This kind of thing, I think, is a model that says this has been successful. And now you are seeing kids who are actually learning American constitutionalism, who maybe weren't politics majors, but now actually get involved in that and decide like, hey, maybe there's something more to this than just the DEI dogma that I'm being trained at every other corner of the university.
Yeah, I think that's right, but you have to be very careful about who runs the thing, right? Because there's an infinite supply of people who will come in and take a bunch of money and defraud the state by pretending to be doing the right thing while giving away the store. And my sense is that in Arizona, that's not quite what happened. So there's actually some decent things coming out of that, but the moment the discretion goes to the president of the university, you have to be very careful about who they bring in to do this stuff. But it is the only, it's maybe the only hope.
Mason, I'd like to jump in and answer a question that was posited by Jace Davidson. He said, where do you find that traditional American history and government courses challenge colonial beliefs and allow students to understand other viewpoints from the losers in our challenging moment in history, i.e. Indigenous, African American, and the LGBT communities? And so there are a couple of things to say to this point, and of course, Richard and Matt, feel free to respond as well. But the one thing that stands out is that right now, you do not have to go very far at all to get just a tidal wave of teaching on precisely these topics. And not only that, but it's a tidal wave of teaching on these topics that is not exactly in the spirit of academic freedom and open inquiry. So at many of the universities, almost all of the universities that I surveyed, there are now mandatory trainings that cover exactly, questions surrounding different narrow identity categories in the United States. And when you require students to take particular trainings on these topics, already the idea of open inquiry is sort of treated suspiciously, because a training is not an occasion to allow students to discuss different ideas, to make up their own minds. A training is typically held when you have information that needs to be transferred from yourself to another person. So, I might, in our workplace, be trained in a new software, in which case it's not me trying to discover or trying to work out a particular idea myself. No, somebody would come in and say, here are the facts, here's what you should believe or know about this particular thing. And so already there's a sort of massive apparatus being constructed at these universities that are trying to present these issues, or present on these issues, and actually trying to present on these issues in a way that students really should not object to, and so are told effectively that you should not object to. Ironically, this model of education is exactly what very, very progressive educators out of sort of the Marxist education tradition criticize. They criticize what's called the banking theory of education, where you have a store of knowledge that you just pass on to another person. There's actually something to that. I would say that in education, you shouldn't just try to pass on knowledge, totally regurgitate knowledge just to be memorized by students. We want students to learn how to think. But that's not really what's happening in the instance of what we're generally criticizing. So already, I would say that the deck is stacked in favor of not just teaching about these topics, but teaching about these topics in such a way that promotes an ideology that I would say is, in many instances, just very shallow. So you have universities peddling, for instance, the so-called characteristics of white supremacy culture. This is basically a concept invented by a totally unqualified diversity trainer that have now become so ubiquitous that in university after university, you'll have trainers coming in saying that things like a sense of urgency or fear of open conflict or objectivity or individualism are all characteristics of white supremacy culture and somehow entail white supremacy. I mean, this is really, really just blatantly silly and wrong-ended. So, if anyone were able to openly challenge it, it would be very easy to do so. But that's typically not what happens, just because of the format. But as far as whether a traditional American history and government course can challenge these things, I would say, absolutely. Traditional American history and government survey course in higher, we're still talking about robust universities with professors who have gone through many years of training in their discipline. So if you have these professors teaching classes on the Constitution, teaching classes on American history, it's not like they're going to ignore major features of American history, including the problems in American history. But what they if you design the curriculum in such a way that emphasizes, the deep study of the American Constitution, deep study of the ideas that brought us here, deep studies of how, as Richard put very, very well, how free society functions, what you will probably get is people who, an education that considers the problematic features of America's past, or however you want to say it, but also considers the merits of the tradition that we have inherited. And we would say that is one outcome that you should seek when you are creating a curriculum, and something that's basically completely neglected when you don't have when you don't have a robust traditional American history and government series. So that I think that we do have ample resources to be self-critical, but at this moment, it's not just, you know, looking at American history and looking at some of the problems that, or, you know, the bad things that America has done. What we have is a education in a very specific, and I would say a very problematic ideology.
Yes, John, I would certainly agree about it being problematic. And that's a great segue into the next question posed by Richard R. Allen, who says, why do we refuse to say critical race theory is only a hypothesis? Has it ever been tested using the scientific method, using a randomized controlled test? If it hasn't, then why is it called a theory? So I want to preface this before I hand it off to whichever of you would like to answer, by certainly recommending the book Cynical Theories, written by Helen Pluckrose and James R. Lindsay, for not just critical race theory, but all of the current applied postmodernist branches of critical theory. So would any of you like to take that one?
I mean, I can jump in just as a, you know, I second your recommendation of Cynical Theories. It's actually quite well done and remarkably scholarly, given it's a scholarly treatment of unscholarly bullshit. So that's it's an interesting thing to study. I actually got in trouble on Twitter once because I described James Lindsay as the world's greatest expert on idiotic nonsense or something like that, and all of his fans got angry at me. It's like, no, it's good. We need people to study idiotic nonsense. But you know, more directly to the question, and if you go back, these are not scholars. These are people. These are activists, and you know, things like "don't let facts get in the way of effectiveness" summarize their. You know, the idea is we want to see this particular type of social change, which invariably means put me in charge of everything, more or less. And they figured out that they could use universities as a tool to do that. So they start playing word games and pretend like they're doing things like we're doing. Like critical is a thing, you know, you ought to do. A theory is something that should happen at a university, but it's not related to sort of the academic process at all. So it almost doesn't even make sense to say we should test this, because to the extent that they throw off predictions or anything, they're just one-off. It's like, oh, that doesn't hold. That doesn't change the fundamental, because the fundamental core of it is activism towards this particular goal. So there's no, you know, you dig deep down, there's no fundamental academic infrastructure underlying it. It's just activism using that language. So I think that's why we don't see that. And if you did try to do that, you would be driven out. You would be not, that means you're not being inclusive, and you're not demonstrating the critical consciousness you need to be part of the diversity group. So you're going to be driven out. So I think that's kind of what's happening there. And nobody's willing to stand up and just say, nah, we're not going to do this.
Anyone else want to jump in on that before I move on?
I mean, I guess I would say, and this is maybe overly flippant, but you know, you hear the term conspiracy theory, right? And no matter how much you go to somebody with evidence or data the other way, they basically just reject it, right? And there's a sort of almost psychosis that's involved in this. And obviously, critical race theory itself explicitly says we reject objective, rational enlightenment type of thinking. So itself, it would again never even lend itself to being questioned. And so even calling it hypothesis almost gives it a more scientific sounding, rationale. And obviously, a lot of the folks on the left who say critical race theory, you know, we see this all the time, again, in K-12. Critical race theory isn't taught in K-12, and they turn around and say, well, critical race theory is just teaching real American history. And it's this sort of idea that even though itself tries to essentially throw overboard any idea of objective, you know, again, testing, data, evidence-based thinking, that it really is a kind of a deviation from that. And I honestly, rather than trying to get into the word games with them, I think just calling it what it is, which is basically a call for blatant racial discrimination, is ultimately what it boils down to.
I would certainly agree with you on that. So I have a question for you all. Why has higher education been so thoroughly captured by these ideas? I mean, I certainly have my own theories, but I'd like to hear yours.
I guess I'll go first. And basically, I'm just going to give a reference. John Ellis has a book called The Breakdown of Higher Education. He's a National Association of Scholars. So if anyone wants to, yeah, he's got the most sort of well thought out structure of how this happened. And it goes back to just, there's an element of chance to it. Faculty expanded when there were a bunch of loony people running around with nothing to do, and they all somehow got jobs at universities, and then they just relentlessly focused hiring and promotion on them. So, and you run into this. I think it's quite plausible, and you'll run into this when you deal with academics who are actual scholars. They're almost to a fault trying to kind of balance all the different ideas, and they're very, we've never heard this before, so maybe we should bring that in. And so you have this entry point where they're like, okay, yeah, we'll consider that. And then you bring in the activists, and the activists won't consider anything else. And so it's a very asymmetric fight. And you also, and people just weren't willing to fight back, and they didn't recognize who these people were until they had pretty much total control, and they're ruthless, and we're not ruthless. So I think that's how, and nobody's watching. There's no monitoring. Like, eventually Disney is going to have to stop doing stupid things if they run out of money. There's no sense in which the University of Texas is ever going to run out of money, no matter how crazy it gets. So there's no check certainly at public universities, and private universities are over-endowed, and they have this reputational capital. So there's no, how bad could things get without Harvard going out of business? Well, Harvard could literally teach nothing to anyone ever and just spend all their time making people dumber and angrier, and they're still going to be Harvard, and people are still going to hire their graduates. So that sort of stickiness, I think, has to do with it. But I highly recommend John Ellis's book.
I'll add to that. I think that what Richard is kind of alluding to, this idea that there's no limiting principle within academia, is important. And when you see this kind of thing now increasingly cropping up in places that are not academia, you can see an imbalance of incentives. So on one hand, there's a pretty strong incentive to at least make yourself look like you're doing something to satisfy activists, satisfy people who are really impassioned about a particular issue, which is why in 2020, not just universities, but private schools and businesses and nonprofits all released, to one extent or another, pretty intricate equity plans or DEI plans or diversity strategic plans. I mean, there is a major uptick in this stuff in, around June of 2020. And there really is not much of an incentive on the part of any individual to push back against that. So if you're in a position of leadership, you certainly don't have the incentive to push back against that. That could cost you your job. It's cost many people their jobs to do, even to say pretty moderate things that kind of cross the line of particular DEI bureaucrats. So just to give one example, a major medical journal, they released one podcast interview that questioned the idea that inequality was had its roots in racism. And that led to basically many members of the editorial team of it's the Journal of the American Medical Association. Many members of that journal basically were forced to resign. And so you have, on one hand, no incentive basically to get rid of this kind of thing. And then as diversity, equity, and inclusion programming takes off, you create further institutional incentive for it to continue to exist. So like the diversity bureaucrat, their job, there is this organization called the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and they've released standards for what a chief diversity officer should do. Many of those activities that just fall into the generally accepted job description of a chief diversity officer in higher education would entail eventually creating more diversity officers who need to justify their job in some way. And one way to do that is to create more stringent things for them to control. So there's sort of, on one hand, no incentive to counterbalance, at least coming from these institutions. And on the other hand, there's a really strong incentive for kind of the perpetuation of this sort of at least institutional structure, which creates, I would say, the perpetuation of particular ideas. So if you have a lot of diversity bureaucrats who want to suddenly say that, for instance, it is racist to use the term trap house, which is what happened at Yale Law School, then that's going to encourage a lot of people to be very careful about what they talk about, and probably very careful about what ideas they'll even consider or what people they will consider reading, because those people are outside the bounds of acceptable opinion. So there's an institutional force that exists. There's very little pressure against it institutionally. And I think that goes to kind of Matt's points about why we need countervailing forces. And some of that is going to come from state legislatures. In a shout out to the reports, in each of the report, I give several recommendations for how this can be countered. It really does need to come from people outside the university, because those are people with real, the real ability to put a stop to it.
I certainly agree. Matt, would you like to say anything before we move on?
I mean, just echoing essentially those same things. I think there's a lack of incentives. They've been able to exist in a bubble, knowing that you're basically getting funding and tenure, regardless of kind of what you say, means that there's, for this time, it has sort of been left to their own devices. And again, while preserving academic freedom, I think is essential, the notion that now they essentially have, again, this lock on public funding and know that they have an essential a monopoly, if not a monopoly, at least the thumb on the scale of, again, public funding going into this. And I do think there are a lot of different strategies that we can use. Again, we mentioned some of the proposals that we're pushing for, but to actually bring some accountability. And it is engaging state lawmakers, I think, to make sure that they recognize that they cannot leave this on autopilot.
No, I certainly agree. So we don't have any more questions right now from our audience, but if anyone has any, please put them in the Q&A box. I suppose my last question for you all is, should we start thinking of reform or revolution? That is to say, at what point should we start thinking bigger? And if higher education has been so thoroughly captured as it currently appears to have been, then what are we going to do? Create new organizations, new universities such as Ralston College, and preserve some others like Hillsdale? Or anyone have any thoughts on that? Can our universities be reformed?
Well, I think things like Ralston and Hillsdale are important sort of proofs of concept. It is possible to have something decent, but if you just look at the scale of higher education spending and where the capital is, those are tiny, and we're not touching enough students. What I see is there is nothing stopping states from fundamental rebuilding of universities. Tenure is an impediment, but it's not, you can eliminate entire departments if you decide that's not what we want to do anymore. I would say you can come very close to just saying, all right, the College of Liberal Arts as it stands at most public state universities, maybe except for economics, although that's even going, is not something we want anymore. So we're going to shut that down and build something new. There'll be lawsuits and all that, but ultimately it's taxpayer money, and ultimately the choice has to be there. There's no the willingness is not there, but the ability is there. I don't think private universities can be saved at all. I think Stanford and Princeton and places like that are doomed. There's no structure. The trustees are structured such that they support the administration. The administration makes sure the trustees are in line. I don't see any mechanism by which elite private universities are anything but a problem going forward. So I think the only options are to either start new things, but that's going to be small, or take state resources that are currently spent on higher education and reallocate them in reasonable ways to reasonable people, and then build up from there. You know, if it turns out that, you know, the 10 best state universities in conservative states are producing better graduates, smarter people, better able to work, more appealing, students will go to these places if they have an option to go somewhere where this stuff is not inflicted on them. If we can hold those up as the examples with real money behind them, because the state spends enormous amounts of money on higher education, hold those up, say this is what education is supposed to look like. What Princeton and Harvard and those guys are doing now is just a joke. You eventually kind of can replace the prestige and move people away from just defaulting to hiring whatever idiot Harvard pops out because they liked his identity profile, and train them to be hate-filled and angry people. So we have to provide an alternative, but we have to use the capital that's installed to provide that alternative. That's my take. Some of my friends at private universities are not actually big fans of that view and would like, you know, Princeton to go back to being a reasonable place, but that's just not happening.
I think this is a good time to think very big and very creatively. And you know, one policy reform that I do not suggest, I focus on very achievable small step policy reforms in all of the case studies. Things like what Matt has proposed, removing and banning any kind of political litmus test, including diversity, equity, inclusion statements, things like that. And that will have a real effect. But I think it's time to even start reconsidering our outsized emphasis on higher education in the first place, which when you start funneling just every student toward higher education rather than creating other options for students to and for people to create a good life for themselves, then you give higher education a lot of power, you give them a lot of money, and you allow for kind of this administrative bloat that exists. I think that there are a lot of places out there that have made good policy proposals about encouraging kind of non-higher education training, that I think the knock-on effect of some of those policies would actually be a reduction in this kind of you know, outlandish and crazy programming at universities. That's not, you know, by itself a sufficient reform, but that is, you know, if you compare the amount of money that our government puts into higher education as compared to workforce training programs, you see that pretty much every you know, the disproportion is huge. We just emphasize higher education over almost anything else and act like that's the only way that you can create a good life for yourself, and that creates certain incentives within the university, and you know, it's time to challenge those kinds of ideas, and when we do, I think we have the opportunity to make interesting reforms. So I'm a big fan of thinking bigger. I'm also in some ways a silly optimist and think that there has to be a way to preserve some of these institutions, and you know, they deserve to be fought for till the bitter end.
Yeah, and I would echo that as well. Again, I don't think it needs to be an either or in terms of reforming or building alternatives. I think both of those, again, you can't try and just say, well, we'll provide a few alternatives that are going to, you know, help 2% of the population. You're still getting swamped, you know, from a civilizational perspective of our American institutions being rejected and DEI supplanting the notions of the Constitution, or are you actually approaching this from all angles? So again, building up those institutions. I do think that you're going to see universities increasingly having a hard time to justify their existence insofar as, we see the student loan crisis right now of debt forgiveness, right? And so if you take some of these proposals where states are going to have to actually, universities take on some of that accountability, and you don't just give them a blank check where students go and don't really care if they get anything from it, they get their credential. You start to change those incentive structures so that the universities maybe are competing with other models for a student who just finished high school and wants to get a high paying job or learn something, but not go through 4 years of basically garbage indoctrination. I do think that you can start to loosen the grip on that. And even the Princetons and the Yales of the world over time, I mean, if employers, and obviously you've got a lot of the woke nonsense in the employment industry as well, but if employers know these graduates are going to come from Brown, Princeton, Yale, and they're going to come cause a bunch of hassles for us, you eventually, obviously this is a long-term thing, but you're going to sort of erode that, even that name recognition of employers are not going to want to have to deal with this. And so I do think that there's kind of firing on all cylinders in terms of what's going to work, but I think absolutely think big, but also targeted reforms, and it's engaging state lawmakers that need to actually take action on this.
Well, thank you all very much. I think we're going to wrap up now. So it was a pleasure to talk to you. I hope to do it again. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Mason.
Yes, thank you guys. Thank you everyone. To everybody who attended, there will be a follow-up email afterwards. So if you would like to share the video, you can do so. And of course, be sure to visit nas.org, go to our reports page, and read John's his case studies. Anyway, all right. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Matt.